Formal session of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. We are taking evidence in relation to our inquiry into the human rights of asylum seekers in the United Kingdom, and we are taking evidence this afternoon in relation to the fact that some asylum seekers in the United Kingdom may end up being sent to Rwanda. And so this afternoon we will be hearing from Paul Rusesabagina, who is a Rwandan government critic, and also from Lewis Mudge, the Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you both, and I'd like to thank you for joining us and hand over to my colleague Helena Kennedy, who's going to ask the first question. I think, Mr. Rusesabagina, you might be speaking, but we can't hear you.
You can hear me?
We can hear you now. Great.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we just check that we can hear you, Mr. Mudge?
Could Mr. Rusesabagina turn the sound up a bit?
Could you turn the sound up a bit, please, Mr. Rusesabagina?
Okay.
Okay, Helena.
Mr. Rusesabagina, I met you before. I met you at the award ceremony when your daughters were given an award, a human rights award, for the work that they had done in securing your release from incarceration in Rwanda. Mr. Rusesabagina, you're a businessman, well known to many because of your background in the film that was made about your work during the time of the terrible genocide in Rwanda. Is that right?
That's right.
I wanted to ask you if you would tell my colleagues here your story as a human rights activist and as an outspoken critic of the Rwandan government. Why were you, did you remain living in Rwanda, and if not, why not?
Actually, I have a long story. It has been almost 30 years that I have been going through torture and everything by the Rwandan government. Because of what I did in 1994, when I happened to help 1,268 people to survive the Rwandan genocide in 1994, in a hotel where I was a general manager, and nobody just happened to get out alive. No one was beaten, no one was taken out, no one was killed. So that became a problem. Because I became popular, and all the journalists who were coming to Rwanda were always willing to talk to me before they talked to anyone else, including President Kagame himself. So at a given time, on September 5th, 1996, I was seated in my home, close to the Kigali Serena Hotel, which used to be the Diplomat Hotel. Today it is the Serena Hotel. I was a general manager there. And I saw a soldier who just came to my home. Now, he said that I had stolen computers from I do not know where, and I had to show him my house. He wanted just me to stand up so that he can shoot me standing up. In my name, I had two visitors. I was very proud to stand up and show him my home. When I stood up, I told him, okay, come, I show you my house. When I was just almost standing, going in front of him, he just pulled out a gun, and our housemaid now shouted and told me that he is going to kill you, Papa Fiston, he is going to kill you, Papa Fiston. I pushed him I was still young. I just pushed him very roughly. He fell down, and I just went out, just calling for help. We were just staying at that hotel. It was very close to a military camp, the main military camp of Rwanda. Then the army guys came to my home and started saying, now they started telling me, oh, that guy did not have a gun. I just shut up. And the following day, on the 6th, I was in my office. I saw his boss coming to my office telling me that, listen, Mr. Rusesabagina, that guy did not have a gun. It was a toy. I told him that, sir, it was a toy because it didn't kill. It didn't kill me, but it was a gun. Then that day, I went to exile, thinking that in exile, I will be in peace. That is when I took a flight, went to Belgium with my elder children, and where I also was harassed many times, because when I arrived in Brussels, once again, because I was very familiar to people, I was speaking loudly, talking to the whole world, especially journalists. That also still remained a problem. The Rwandan government followed me, tried to kill me by all means, until a time when even the Rwandan ambassador moved from the residence of the Rwandan embassy, came to live behind my house in Brussels.
Paul, if I may pause for a minute, I think many of us know something about your background and about the terrible story of what happened, because you were threatened, you were held, as you've described, someone was there sent to assassinate you, and you were saved by really a maid who worked for you, and you had to flee your country and you went to Belgium, and you've had to live abroad for many years since, but you have been an outspoken critic and a follower of events in Rwanda and of the conditions of the people in Rwanda, and that has continued to bring down the attention of the President, Mr. Kagame, and his men, and you have been harassed, followed, threatened, and your life has basically been pretty wretched, living abroad even. Is that right?
Well, that's a very long question.
Hang on a second.
We're just trying to get through the story, and if you want, go away and read it.
It has not only followed like that, but also I was also kidnapped, and I was tortured. I was kidnapped from Dubai, taken to Kigali, where I was just I was tortured, and my head was put in a bag. Can you imagine the head put in the bag kind of tied, hands tied in the back, legs tied, and thrown in a car and taken to places which they call safe places. What do they call them? Safe places. That is where they kill people. To them, they are safe because they are the only ones who know those places where they torture and kill people. I was there for 4 days being tortured, and also you can imagine no moving, just on the ground. And at that given time, I had a military boot on my neck. You can imagine that. It is just an abattoir where I could hear many other people behind in the next door. In the next door, I could hear many people. It was very dark, 24 hours a day, but people making noise, calling, being tortured, calling for help. And for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and after 3 hours approximately, because I could not see the water, I couldn't see anything. I was tired, as I'm telling you. I could hear the voice now slowly just disappearing, getting lost. That is what happened in those abattoirs in Rwanda. I call them the abattoir. They call them the safe houses because they are the only ones who know those houses.
You were saying that it was like an abattoir. It was like a place for handling animals. Yeah? That's what you've said. You said that you were kidnapped in Dubai. You were going through Dubai airport, and you were then taken Were you willingly participating in this, or were you brought to Rwanda?
Actually, I was not really going to Rwanda. I was invited by a Rwandan agent who called himself a Burundese, who called himself a man of God, a pastor, a bishop. Then he used his lawyer in Brussels, Innocent. He used Innocent Twagiramungu, who told me he was his lawyer. Then he knew he was a Burundese, and he was a pastor, had churches. He's the one who invited me. He's the one I met in a private jet. And then in Dubai, we were supposedly flying to Bujumbura, not to Kigali. And of course, the pilot. When I met the bishop,
Mr. Rusesabagina, I'm going to have to interrupt here and explain to you that I'm terribly sorry, but because of the limits of Parliament, we have only an hour for this evidence session, and if we go into this level of detail, we're not going to be able to cover everything. Now, as Helena has said, many of us have been well briefed about your background, and we have some quite specific, focused questions we want to ask. Now, please understand, I don't wish to be rude in any way, and I don't wish to diminish the awfulness of your experiences, but because I've got to chair this meeting and we don't have very long, I need to try and focus our questions a bit more. If necessary, we can get you to write to us afterwards if there's things that you want to elaborate on. But I think Helena has some quite specific questions to ask you, and then we'll move on to Lord Murray next.
Well, let me just finish. We know from your history that you ended up being taken to Kigali, and you were held in custody in the way that you've described, and you were put on trial. Did you receive a fair trial?
I did not receive a fair trial. Not at all. There is no fair trial in Rwanda.
Were you able to choose your own lawyers?
The Rwandan government refused to give me they refused my international lawyers. And also they told me that they have 1,500 lawyers, Rwandan lawyers, who can intervene for me. When I asked the list, they gave me a list of 5.
So you were given a list from which to choose lawyers, and they had to be Rwandan. And did you consider that they would be independent of government and of any kind of pressure?
No, they were not. Nobody is independent from the government in Rwanda. Either you are with the Rwandan Patriotic Front, Kagame's political party, or you are the enemy, and the enemy in Rwanda is always killed, is to die.
Have you or any family members been targeted or persecuted in Rwanda as a result of your political views or your human rights activism?
Well, when I was in prison, my brother, my younger brother, was called to come to talk to the Rwandan Investigation Bureau almost every week. If you go online, you will see my sister being called to come and testify, tell them, being forced to tell them who I am. And she is a 76-year-old woman who has nothing to do with politics, who lives in that rural area.
So your sister, your brother, and all because of you and your criticism of the government's political stance.
For 2 years and 7 months that I stayed in prison, nobody from my family or a friend could visit me and see me and know how I am.
Were you given medical attention while you were in prison?
At a given time, even my own medicines I had, because I take 2 tablets every day. Even those ones were just confiscated taken away until a time after many months when the international community raised voices and started talking. That is when I got them.
We've heard evidence about other people being kept in solitary confinement. Were you kept in solitary confinement?
When I was kidnapped, I was, first of all, taken to the butchery. And from the butchery, I was taken to the police in a confinement for 18 days. And then from there, I was always being tortured. I was taken to the prison, living in a small room of about 2.5 meters and what length, and maybe 2 meters large, without a window. I was not even able to put on the light myself. They were putting on the light from from outside. They were the ones. I was going out 1 hour a day, just 1 hour.
You got to go outside for 1 hour a day. And did they provide you with anything to sleep on? Because we've heard evidence from another witness that they had nothing to sleep on when they were being detained prior to their trial. Did you have a mattress or anything?
Yes, for me, they gave me a kind of a small bed, tiny bed, and a blanket.
And I think what you're describing there is the conditions you were kept in before your trial. After you were convicted and sent to prison, can you tell us what your conditions were like when you were in prison?
After my conviction, I just had to pull out from the trial because it was just kind of short trial. And when I pulled out, nothing changed. For the first almost 10 months, between August 27th in the night and June 12th, 2021, I was in that confinement without a window, with the cameras watching me 24 hours a day on top.
Can you tell us how you came to be freed from prison?
Well, the whole world stood up. The whole world happened to know that what I was going through was a kind of show. It was not really a trial. That is when the EU Bar Association wrote and signed a kind of a recommendation. Shall I call it a recommendation to the whole world to tell that this was a show. The U.S. Bar Association did the same thing. The UN, the Human Rights Organization, did the same thing. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, many countries, the EU also did the same thing. The Congress in the United States, the Senate, everybody just wrote resolutions and they signed them until a time when even the State Department and the White House called my kidnapping a kind of hostage.
So you were, of course, you were helped by the EU, the United Nations, and ultimately by President Biden. But of course, you were a very well-known figure because of the film that had been made about you. Do you think if you hadn't been a well-known figure, you would have got that help? What do you think would have happened to you if you hadn't been well-known internationally? Do you think you'd still be in prison?
That is a very exciting question and very interesting. Now, so far, I'm the only one who has been kidnapped, taken to Rwanda, and happened to get out alive so far. That prison is a hell.
You say, I'm the only one who's been kidnapped, taken to Rwanda, and who has got out alive.
That prison was hell.
Yeah.
Murray.
Right. Simon, I know you want to come in and ask a couple of questions.
Yes, certainly. Mr. Rusesabagina, we've been provided with some background information. Is it right that in December 2018 you put a video on YouTube in which you denounced Mr. Kagame's government?
Well, I always denounced Mr. Kagame. I don't remember what I said in 2018. I always denounced the torture, whatever was done by the Rwandan government, and even today, I'm doing it.
In that particular video, it's suggested that you, in that video, pledged your unreserved support to the FLN, which is the National Liberation Forces, which is the armed wing of the Movement for Democratic Change. Did you say that?
Well, I think the world misunderstood what I said. The world misunderstood what I said because in Kinyarwanda, you ask your child to do whatever he or she can to bring a kind of a bucket of water. By all means, that is always very much said. And that FLN you are talking about was no more a member of our organization. We had kicked FLN out. It was no more a member of the organization.
In your experience of Rwanda today, given the legal guarantees in the Constitution, to what extent do you believe individuals can freely express dissent and protest?
Individuals can never talk. There's no freedom of speech. There is no freedom at all. That is in Rwanda, that is zero. Rwanda talks about refugees all over and every time. They talk about the Congolese refugees whom they themselves attacked the Congo. The Congolese people crossed the border and came to Rwanda. But Rwanda, you remember what happened in 2018 when the Congolese refugees, because of lack of food, they were not given enough food, then they demonstrated. 12 of them were immediately killed. I mean refugees who had no weapons, nothing. They were immediately killed.
That was in 2012.
More than 20 injured, and many of them taken to prison. So in Rwanda, there is nothing like freedom. That is zero.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to bring Lord Dolakia in with some questions for Human Rights Watch.
Can I put a question to Paul? Paul, in 2020, you were arrested and subsequently imprisoned in Rwanda. Do you think you had a fair system within which your rights and expression?
I wonder, Lord Dolakia, I think we covered that with Paul. I wonder if you could focus on a question for Mr. Mudge from Human Rights Watch.
Can I come back to you, Mr. Mudge? You've been mentioning human rights condition in Rwanda since before the 1994 genocide. Do you believe that individuals in Rwanda currently have their human rights respected, including the right to freedom of expression and protest?
Sorry, is that a question for Human Rights Watch or for Paul? I apologize.
Forgive me, gentlemen, we're very tight for time here for reasons I'm not at liberty to go into. So I'm just moving on to ask Lewis Mudge some questions now. I mean, we'll come back to you in a moment, Paul. But I think the question was, Mr. Mudge, you've been monitoring human rights conditions in Rwanda since before the genocide. That's right, isn't it? You've had a long involvement. And we know that you and your organisation have a lot of experience in this area and have reported on Rwanda in detail. So it's really just an overview that we want at this point. Do you believe that individuals in Rwanda currently have their human rights respected, in particular the right to freedom of expression and the right to protest?
Sure. Thank you for that. Short answer is no. Just by means of, and I'll be very brief, by means of context for full disclosure, I was still in high school in 1993, but yes, HRW first opened its office in Butare in 1993. We subsequently moved the office up to Kigali. I joined Human Rights Watch in 2010, have been there for 14 years. And for many of those years, I was the Rwanda researcher until I was kicked out in 2018. I was the third researcher over the course of 10 years to have been made persona non grata from Rwanda.
You were kicked out of Rwanda in the midst of doing your job as a researcher for Human Rights Watch, and you say you're the third person from your organisation who's been kicked out in that way. Can you just tell us a wee bit more about that?
Sure. First, a researcher, Alison DeForge, she wrote what is regarded by many people to be the seminal work on the genocide. It's called Leave None to Tell the Story. She was refused entry in 2009 and told not to return. Very tragically, just a few months later, she died in a plane crash. After that, Karina Tertsakian, a British national, she was kicked out of the country while doing her work for Human Rights Watch in, and you'll have to excuse me, I don't have the dates in front of me, but I believe it was 2010. Right. I arrived shortly after. My work visa was pulled in 2015, subsequently forcing me and my family to move to Kenya. But I was going back and forth, and in 2018, I was denied full access to the country and told I was, quote unquote, undesirable. It's sort of par for the course for Rwanda. Independent human rights experts are very rarely granted full access, but it's not out of the question as well to be denied any access, as has been the case for Human Rights Watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So can I just now address the question you'd asked previously?
Yeah, the question.
I'll be very, very brief with regards to freedom of expression, freedom of association. No, short answer, no. It really doesn't exist in Rwanda by any definition of the term. And just to give my personal experience covering the country for 14 years, unfortunately, I've seen people's right to express themselves freely be further and further constrained. And so when I started HRW, we were still working in the context of newspapers and trying to fight for those journalists to have any means of space by which to express independent points of view or do independent, free and fair reporting. That was restricted. Very sadly, it resulted in some journalists being assassinated and crimes that to this day are still not solved. A lot of self-censorship. In the mid-teens, I would say, we did see a spike in talk shows, radio talk shows. These were Ken Rwanda talk shows. And you did see some independent radio stations try to push the envelope a little bit, whereby they enabled people to call in and express themselves anonymously. And very quickly, we saw those shows shut down. I think most lately what we've seen is this attack on bloggers, this attack on people who try to post things on YouTube. You are seeing these individuals now being rounded up and facing really serious prison sentences for trying to express themselves. So whenever there are forays by Rwandans to try to push that space, unfortunately, you see that space clamp down and get tighter and tighter. I won't go into too much detail. I know time is of the essence, but there are things that are completely forbidden to discuss in Rwanda, and this goes way beyond ethnicity. You are not allowed to criticize the government in Rwanda, and that does not mean President Kagame. That means government policies more broadly.
Thank you.
What about broader freedom of expression and freedom of association? What about trade unions? Do trade unions exist in Rwanda? Are they able to freely organise?
There are trade unions, and yes, that's a valid point. And to some degree, trade unions, as it pertains to lobbying on behalf of their members with regards to contracts, I would say that there is some space there, yes. However, when Habyarimana started to face some stiff resistance in the early 90s, trade unions were one of the key groups with civil society that led the charge. And we don't see anything like that in modern day Rwanda with what we saw in the early 90s with regards to the power and organizing capacity of trade unions. So I won't say that the space for trade unions doesn't exist, but not in a meaningful way by which they could actually advocate for broader change.
What about this genocide law we've heard about? We've heard about people being prosecuted for spreading rumours, and we've heard about people being prosecuted for views they've expressed. about the genocide. And it seems to me as a lawyer that this law is very broadly drawn and interferes fundamentally with the right to freedom of expression. But that's just my impression as somebody coming to this with not your expertise. Can you tell us a bit about that law and how it impacts on freedom of expression?
Yeah, I think the genocide ideology law is important. And it was used, it was applied more a few years ago, meaning 10 years ago. You did see more prosecutions under genocide ideology. Because genocide ideology is tricky in Rwanda, and because of the international backlash that you saw against the use of genocide ideology, and when I say the use of genocide ideology law and persecuting people, broadly what this entails, and I'm speaking generally, so you'll have to give me some rope here, but broadly what that entails is people who also raise the very real fact that the RPF, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, which subsequently became the government, committed some very serious crimes from July 1994 on, after they took control of Kigali, in killing at least tens of thousands of ethnic Hutu in Rwanda, and also in the subsequent invasion, first in South Kivu in 1996 in Congo, and the subsequent Rwandan invasions in the Congo and the crimes that were committed there. Those questions, if you raise those issues in Rwanda, you had a real, you did and do have a real legitimate risk of being persecuted under genocide ideology legislation. So there is a narrative on the genocide that is not necessarily false, but it very much does incorporate all the facts. And that, if you question that narrative, you very much risk being persecuted under that. But I think more to the point, and frankly, what's more worrying for us is what they've installed now in the criminal code with regards to criticism of Rwanda. So right now, in the criminal code, if you criticize the government, you can be prosecuted for creating a hostile opinion of Rwanda, a hostile international opinion of Rwanda. And that is really, really worrying, because that's broader. That goes way beyond the genocide ideology aspect. And that is, if you criticize Rwanda, and we are seeing journalists being locked up and giving criminal penalties, so 10, 12-year penalties. If you are locked up for that, that is what you've done, is you've just criticized the government. You've criticized government policy. Paul Rusesabagina earlier alluded to the Kiziba killings of this dozen Congolese refugees in Rwanda on the South Kivu border. And I worked very closely with that case. I was living in Nairobi at the time, and I was communicating daily with these people. And there's one of those leaders of those Congolese refugees was imprisoned. He was given a 15-year sentence. And one of the key elements of proof was WhatsApp messages with me. And they said that these WhatsApp messages are you trying to create a hostile image of Rwanda. And that should be really, really worrying. I mean, an individual should be allowed to have a WhatsApp conversation with a human rights investigator and not fear that that conversation will be used in court against him to create a hostile image of the state.
Well, that's very interesting. So say in a hypothetical case, somebody who'd sought asylum in the United Kingdom was sent to Rwanda, went through the procedures there and got asylum in Rwanda. Could they then, as a Rwandan citizen then, or be prosecuted for criticising the Rwandan government in the same way as you described what happened to this Congolese gentleman?
Yeah, and your fault. I mean, this is obviously what I was trying to help walk you to that conclusion. Yeah. So yes, and I want to try to be as clear and as unequivocal to the members present. An asylum seeker or a refugee will not be able to criticize the circumstances in which he or she is held in Rwanda, because this issue is very important to Rwanda. It knows the government, it knows the world is watching. It knows it stands to gain a lot by making this work, and it is not going to allow criticism from the participants. And so those people do face, in our opinion, a very significant risk of being threatened with this type of legislation, or an example being made of them and this actually happening. And I think it's worth noting that there's been these points made by proponents of this plan that yes, 2018 was a very unfortunate event, but since then there hasn't been any further refugee uprisings. And that's very clear. They rounded up 60 of these people and threw them in jail after killing a dozen of them. There wasn't one state security officer held accountable, wasn't even questioned in a serious fashion, to the best of our knowledge. And yet the people who rose up to try to get better food allotments for a Congolese camp, they certainly were punished. And yes, it's not surprising that since 2018, we haven't seen any real uprising since then, because the message was sent very, very clearly to the leaders of that Congolese camp.
Right, so that brings me to my next question. What are your views on the UK-Rwanda partnership and the suite of measures that the UK government have proposed, such as the UK-Rwanda Treaty and the Safety of Rwanda Bill? And to what extent do you think these measures are going to be sufficient to ensure that people removed from the United Kingdom to Rwanda live in a regime that's compliant with the UK's human rights obligations?
Yeah, I mean, I by means of background, you can tell from my accent, I'm not British, I'm American, but I did study in Edinburgh. I studied law in Edinburgh, and I studied at SOAS, so I have some knowledge of the UK and its obligations. And obviously, we have our London office, and I've been briefed very closely, and I work very closely with our UK colleagues. Look, it's our opinion that the UK government has an obligation to comply with non-refoulement in both international and domestic law. The Supreme Court has been very clear, and it said there's a risk of refoulement, and that it is unlawful to send people back to Rwanda because of that risk. And so it is our opinion that this legislation and this treaty are not consistent. The legislation was not consistent with the law, and that the treaty isn't consistent with the law. And so to your question, you know, we have this treaty that says it's going to train them up and it's going to put in place these safeguards, and you know, there'll be these mechanisms in place. I would like to address that on 3 points. Number one, with regards to the treaty, and I think this is really important, Rwanda is not a good faith partner when it comes to complying with treaties if it doesn't suit their interests. It was only yesterday that the U.S. ambassador at the United Nations said there was credible evidence that Rwandan troops had shot at UN, not Congolese, but UN aerial assets in Goma. This is a country that sends peacekeepers to the Central African Republic, but also is alleged to have shot at UN assets as recently as yesterday. With regards to transnational repression, yes, there are Rwandans who are targeted outside of Rwanda. I think everyone knows that. What's reported less is the Rwandan refugees outside of Rwanda who are kidnapped and brought back to Rwanda. And I've met these individuals in prison in Rwanda. So these are registered refugees under all the protections and statutes by the UNHCR. They have registered refugee numbers, and we publish them. And I'm happy to share that with the committee. And they are kidnapped out of it's usually Congo and Burundi, and they're brought back to Rwanda. And there's a complete violation of obligations with regards to refugee norms and the way refugees are supposed to be treated by the government of Rwanda. Another example of this non-compliance is the Convention Against Torture, the CAT treaties, the UN CAT treaties. These are vital treaties to address torture. Rwanda hasn't submitted a report in over 2 years, rendering it, it's 2 years late, it's rendering it almost impossible to do a meaningful investigation into torture that groups like ours and Amnesty and many other groups have documented for many years. The Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture in 2017 had to suspend, and in 2018 canceled a visit to Rwanda. The only time it's ever done this, because it could not get guarantees for the safety of people it was trying to speak to, and it couldn't get access to these to the places where torture was being alleged to have occurred. So, on the first point, with regards to a treaty in of itself, I do not think Rwanda is going to be a good faith actor on this, and they have demonstrated over and over again in the past that when it comes to violating treaties, it's more than happy to do so if that suits its best interest. Number two, the safeguards that are being proposed these sort of measures that are going to rectify issues that the Supreme Court identified, just to play devil's advocate and go along with that, there's no time right now to assess whether these safeguards are going to be effective. So in that context, you have to default to where Rwanda is now. And the fact is that this is a judiciary that's not independent. This is not an independent judiciary. Paul Rusesabagina's case is a high-profile case of a very problematic legal case that was not free and fair. But for every Paul Rusesabagina's case, we've documented dozens and dozens of other cases of people who are not high-profile, who did not have a Hollywood movie made about them, who also faced grossly unfair trials in which a raft of trial violations were committed. And so we have to go back to that default until the time has been made for these checks that are being proposed to have taken effect, and that is a very, very low baseline. But finally, and I want to bring this back. This is the third point that I want to make with regards to what we were discussing earlier. Even with these guardrails in place, this is not going to make Rwanda start respecting human rights. And as such, the people who are sent there, they're not going to be able to go to any type of monitoring committee. Some of these committees also might be actually bodies set up by the Rwandan government anyway. But even if it was an independent monitoring committee, there's no assurances that a claim about them being unhappy will be treated freely and fairly. On the contrary, the default is that any claim made by these asylum seekers that they're not happy with the situation they're in will be considered criticism of networks and systems set up by the government of Rwanda. And as we've tried to demonstrate, Mr. Rusesabagina and myself, that is very, very dangerous to do in Rwanda. And it doesn't matter if you're a foreigner. It is very, very dangerous to criticize what's happening. And so I think on a number of fronts, this is being rushed. If we were to give it even to give it the benefit of the doubt, it's being rushed. But to be more realistic, you're not going to flick a switch and make Rwanda start respecting rights when the track record, basically since 1994, and obviously there's some variations that we could discuss, but we don't have time to do that. But the track record is that this country this government does not respect basic fundamental human rights.
The third point, have I missed that? Because I was taking a careful note of everything you've said, but you said you wanted to address the treaty on 3 points. Have we moved on to the third one, or do you want to come to
the third one was going back to your earlier point, which was that there's not going to be a means for these people to express themselves inside Rwanda with regards to their treatment. So we have to default back to the baseline, which is that not only is that means not going to be there, but it's actually going to be very risky for them. And let me just finish by saying I'm basing this on personal experience. I mean, it's been talked about in the media, but not to a huge degree. But in around 2016, 2017, and again, I don't have my notes in front of me, but Israel did embark on a scheme whereby they sent Eritreans to Rwanda. And I was still accessing the country, and I was still going in when these gentlemen were arriving. And I mean, yes, this was not done through a treaty through the UK, so I get it, it's different. But I can draw really broad-based generalities from it, which was that this was completely handled in a way that was just not respecting any type of normal procedures, let alone human rights. These guys were taken through a side door in the airport. They got involved in schemes where they had to pay immigration officials, and eventually they were all shipped up to the Ugandan border and kicked into the bush and told to find their own way up to Uganda and make it on their own. So there has been a dry run of this. The default was not to treat these Eritreans that were shipped over from Israel with empathy, with compassion. It was not to acknowledge that they were all men, that these men were facing incredibly difficult circumstances in Eritrea. The default was to shut these guys up. Don't let Human Rights Watch find them. Warn them not to talk to people like me. So we had to take enormous efforts to actually speak. And I had to, when finding them, it was incredibly difficult to find them. Warn them. And then finally, when they became an issue, ship them up to the Uganda border and get rid of them. So, it's not the same. This wasn't done in the context of a UK treaty. And I acknowledge all of that. But it does sort of show you the default and the baseline as to where things could go.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm going to